Hey everyone, welcome back to our chapter book read-along of Holes by Louis Sachar. Now, we are on chapter 29 and a new part to the book. So our book is split into two parts, part 1 and part 2. So we're going to begin part 2 today. But I want to see what you guys remember of part 1. So if you're watching this with someone, pause the video, talk about the things that you remember from the story, maybe your favorite parts, one of the characters or two, and then here goes my quick review. Holes is about a boy named Stanley Yelnats. He is always in the wrong place at the wrong time, and one of these times, he was literally hit in the head with some very expensive shoes. Well, no one believed that he got hit in the head with some shoes, so they thought that he stole them. The judge, who said that he stole them, gave him two options. He could go to jail or he could go to Camp Green Lake. Well, Stanley'd never been to camp before, so he chose Camp Green Lake. Camp Green Lake is a camp for not good boys. They have all done something wrong, and that is why they are there. They also don't have any green at Camp Green Lake, nor is there a lake. There are just holes for as far as you can see in a big barren space that used to be a lake. The boys have to dig a hole every single day. They say it builds character. Out in the hot, hot sun. Well, Stanley learns that the warden is looking for something, because they aren't just digging holes to build character. She wants to find something out on that old barren lake. And then we also learn about Stanley's ancestors. So first, his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He made a deal with a woman named Madame Zeroni. Well, he broke that deal, so they are all cursed. Just very unlucky people. And then, also, his great-grandfather, he was held up by Kissin' Kate Barlow, who was an outlaw in the Wild West of Texas. Fun fact, she also lived in Green Lake before the lake dried up. We learned about her and her story as well. How she was a school teacher named Catherine Barlow, how she fell in love with the onion picker named Sam and made delicious spiced peaches, and how the townspeople were horrible to her and Sam. They burned down the schoolhouse just because Sam was black and Sam and Catherine kissed. Not good stuff. Well, we find out that is why Catherine Barlow became Kissin' Kate Barlow. She was not happy, so she became an outlaw. We learn at the end that Trout Walker, a gentleman who used to like Catherine Barlow, was looking for her loot, all the money she stole from all the banks. And he did not find them. Catherine got bit by a yellow-spotted lizard and died laughing. So, we will see what comes next in our story as we continue Holes. Enjoy! Part 2 of Holes, The Last Hole. Chapter 29. There was a change in the weather, for the worse. The air became unbearably humid. Stanley was drenched in sweat. Beads of moisture ran down his handle of his shovel. It almost was as if the temperature had gotten so hot that the air itself was sweating. A loud boom of thunder echoed across the empty lake. A storm was way off to the west, beyond the mountains. Stanley could count more than 30 seconds between the flash of lightning and the clap of thunder. That was how far away the storm was. Sound travels a great distance across a barren wasteland. Usually, Stanley couldn't see the mountains at this time of day. The only time they were visible was at sunup, before the air became hazy. Now, however, the sky was very dark off to the west, and every time lightning flashed, the dark shape of mountains could briefly appear. "Come on, rain!" Armpits shouted. "Blow this way!" "Maybe it'll rain so hard it'll fill up the whole lake," said Squid. "We can go swimming." 40 days and 40 nights, said X-Ray. "Guess we better start building us an ark. Get 2 of each animal, right?" "Right," said Zigzag. 2 rattlesnakes, 2 scorpions, 2 yellow-spotted lizards. The humidity, or maybe the electricity in the air, had made Zigzag's head even more wild-looking. His frizzy blonde hair stuck out almost straight. The horizon lit up with a huge web of lightning. In that split second, Stanley thought he saw an unusual rock formation on top of one of the mountain peaks. The peak looked to him exactly like a giant fist, with the thumb sticking straight up. Then it was gone. And Stanley wasn't sure whether he'd seen it or not. "I found refuge on God's thumb." That was what his great-grandfather had supposedly said after Kate Barlow had robbed him and left him stranded in the desert. No one ever knew what he meant by that. He was delirious when he said it. But how could he live for 3 weeks without food or water? Stanley had asked his father. "I don't know, wasn't there," replied his father. "I wasn't born yet. My father wasn't born yet. My grandmother, your great-grandmother, was a nurse in the hospital where they treated him. He'd always talked about how she'd dab his forehead with a cool, wet cloth. He said that's why he fell in love with her. He thought she was an angel. A real angel." His father didn't know. What about after he got better? Did he ever say what he meant by God's thumb, or how he survived? No, he just blamed his no-good pig-stealing father. The storm moved off farther west, along with any hope of rain. But the image of the fist and thumb remained in Stanley's head, although instead of lightning flashing behind the thumb, in Stanley's mind, the lightning was coming out of the thumb, as if it were the thumb of God. Chapter 30. The next day was Zigzag's birthday, or so he said. Zigzag lay in his cot as everyone headed outside. "I get to sleep in, because it's my birthday." Then, a little while later, he cut into the breakfast line, and just in front of Squid. Squid told him to go to the end of the line. "Hey, it's my birthday," Zigzag said, staying where he was. "It's not your birthday," said Magnet, who was standing behind Squid. "Is too," said Zigzag. "July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know the day of the week it was, let alone the date. It could have been July 8th, but how would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out just how long he'd been at Camp Green Lake, if it indeed was July 8th. "I came here on May 24th, he said aloud, "so that means I've been here 46 days, said Zero. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at Zero. He'd learned not to doubt him when it came to math. 46 days. It felt more like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole the first day, and he hadn't dug one yet today. That meant he'd dug 44 holes, if it really was July 8th. "Can I have an extra carton of juice?" Zigzag asked Mr. Sir. "It's my birthday." To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. Hole number 45. "The 45th hole is the hardest," he said to himself. But it really wasn't true, and he knew it. He was a lot stronger than when he first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and harsh conditions. Mr. Sir was no longer depriving him of water. After having to get by on less water for a week or so, Stanley now felt like he had all the water he could want. Of course it helped that Zero dug some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward while Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually he stood around while, before sitting off by himself on the hard ground, with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging, but not a lot better. When the sun came up a couple of hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountains were a little more than dark shadows on the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot where the top of one mountain seemed to jut upward, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of the sun, reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that he was somewhere near where Kate Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather. If that really was her lipstick tube he'd found, then she must have lived somewhere around here. Zero took his turn before the lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole, and Zero climbed down into it. "Hey, caveman," said Zigzag, "you should get a whip. Then your slave doesn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back." "He's not my slave," said Stanley. "We have a deal, that's all." "A good deal for you," said Zigzag. "It was Zero's idea, not mine." "Don't you know, Zig," said X-Ray, coming over, "Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero likes to dig holes." "He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him," said Squid. "What about me?" said Armpit. "I like to dig holes too. Can I dig for you, Caveman, after Zero's finished?" The other boys laughed. "No, I want to," said Zigzag. "It's my birthday." Stanley tried his best to ignore them. Zigzag kept at it. "Come on, Caveman, be a pal. Let me dig your hole." Stanley smiled, as if it were all a big joke. When Mr. Pendanski arrived with water and lunch, Zigzag offered Stanley his place in line, "since you're so much better than me." Stanley remained where he was. "I didn't say I was "You're insulting him, Zig," said X-Ray. "Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman?" "No," said Stanley. "Sure you are," said X-Ray. "Now come to the front of the line where you belong." "That's okay," said Stanley. "No, it's not okay," said X-Ray. "Get up here." Stanley hesitated. Then he moved to the front of the line. "Well, this is a first," Mr. Pendanski said, coming around the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad that he'd be digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole anymore. But he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into his sandwich, which contained some kind of meat and cheese mixture that came in a can. Just about everything at Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came only once a month. He glanced up to see Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. "I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole," said Zigzag. Squid laughed. "Here, take my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it out for him. "No thanks," said Stanley. "Come on, take my cookie," said Zigzag, sticking it in his face. "Leave me alone," said Stanley. "Please eat my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away, and Zigzag pushed him back. "Don't push me." "I didn't," said Stanley, and he stood up and got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Pendanski was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. "I said, don't push me." Stanley took a step backward, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, "Quit pushing." "Lay off," said Armpit, as he, Magnet, and X-Ray joined him. "Why should he?" snapped X-Ray. "Caveman's bigger. He should take care of himself." "I don't want any trouble," Stanley said. Zigzag pushed him hard. "Eat my cookie," he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Pendanski coming toward him, along with Zero. "Hi, Mom," said Armpit. "We're just fooling around." "I saw what's going on," Mr. Pendanski said. He turned to Stanley. "Go ahead, Stanley." Hit him back. You're bigger." Stanley stared at Mr. Pendanski in astonishment. "Teach a bully a lesson," said Mr. Pendanski. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with his open hand. "Teach me a lesson," he said. Stanley made a feeble attempt to punch Zigzag. Then he felt a flurry of fists against his head and neck. Zigzag had hold of his collar with one hand and was hitting him with the other. The collar ripped, and Stanley fell backwards onto the dirt. "That's enough!" Mr. Pendanski yelled. It wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. "Stop!" shouted Mr. Pendanski. The side of Stanley's face was pressed flat against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fist slammed off his arms and pounded his face into the ground. All he could do was wait for it to be over. Then, suddenly, Zigzag was off him. Stanley managed to look up, and he saw that Zero had his arm around Zigzag's long neck. Zigzag made a gagging sound as he desperately tried to pry Zero's arms off him. "You're going to kill him!" shouted Mr. Pendanski. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Pendanski fired his pistol into the air. The other counselors came running from the office, the tents, or out on the lake. They had their guns drawn, but holstered them when they saw that the trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. "There was a riot," Mr. Pendanski told her. "Zero almost strangled Ricky." The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. "What happened to you?" "Nothing. It wasn't a riot." "Ziggy was beating up the caveman," said Armpit. "Then Zero started choking Zigzag, and I had to pull the Zero off of Zigzag. It was all over before Mom fired his gun." "They all just got a little hot, that's all," said X-Ray. "You know how it is. In the sun all day, people get hot, right? But everything's cool now." "I see," said the warden. She turned to Zigzag. "What's the matter? Didn't get a puppy for your birthday?" "Zig's just a little hot," said X-Ray. "Out in the sun all day, you know how it is. Blood starts to boil." "Is that what happened, Zigzag?" asked the warden. "Yeah," said Zigzag. "It's like X-Ray said. Working too hard out in the hot sun, while Caveman just sits around doing nothing. My blood boiled." "Excuse me?" said the warden. "Caveman digs his holes like everybody else." Zigzag shrugged. "Sometimes." "Excuse me?" "Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day," said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. "I'm teaching him how to read and write," said Stanley. "It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so it doesn't matter who digs it." "Excuse me?" said the warden. "Isn't it more important for him to learn to read?" Stanley asked. "Doesn't that build character more than digging holes?" "That's his character," said the warden. "What about your character?" Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to Zero. "Well, Zero, what have you learned so far?" Zero said nothing. "Have you just been digging Caveman's hole for nothing?" the warden asked him. "He likes to dig holes," said Mr. Pendanski. "Tell me what you learned yesterday," said the warden. "Surely you can remember that." Zero said nothing. Mr. Pendanski laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, "You might as well teach this shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero." "The at sound," said Zero. "The at sound?" repeated the warden. "Well then, tell me, what does C-A-T spell?" Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew he knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. "Cat," Zero said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. "Bravo! Bravo! The boy's a genius." "F-A-T?" said the warden. Zero thought a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, Zero whispered. Fat. What about H-A-T? Asked the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Zero concentrated hard, then said, Chat? All the counselors laughed. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Pendanski. He's so stupid he doesn't even know he is. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for Zero. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he'd realize that it's very logical for Zero to think that the letter H made the ch sound. Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's hole, the warden said, and no more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Good, said the warden. She turned to Stanley. You know why you're digging holes? Because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole for you, then you're not learning your lesson, are you? I guess not, Stanley mumbled, although he knew they weren't digging just for a lesson. She was looking for something that belonged to Kissing Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my own hole and then teach Zero to read? He asked. What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, the warden said. It leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, said Mr. Pendanski. I know you mean well, Stanley, but let's face it. Zero's too stupid to learn to read. That's why it makes his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Mr. Pendanski handed him a shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you're ever good for. Zero took the shovel, then swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed across Mr. Pendanski's face. His knees crumpled beneath him. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The counselors all drew their guns. Zero held the shovel out in front of him, as if he were going to try to bat away the bullets. I hate digging holes, he said, then slowly backed away. Don't shoot him, said the warden. He can't go anywhere. The last thing we need is an investigation. Zero kept backing up, out past the cluster of holes the boys had been digging, then further and further out onto the lake. He's gonna have to come back for water, the warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground near his hole. A couple of the counselors helped Mr. Pendanski to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out toward Zero, but he had disappeared in the haze. The warden ordered the counselors to take turns guarding the shower room and the rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. When he returned, he was to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails. It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected 7 holes. Chapter 31. Stanley angrily dug his shovel into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Pendanski, the warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But mostly, he was angry at himself. He knew he never should have let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read. If Zero could dig all day and still have strength to learn, he should have been able to dig all day and still have strength to teach. What he should do, he thought, was go out after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole. Now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out on the lake, digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go out after Zero. There was nobody to stop him. He kept thinking that's what he should do. Maybe they could climb the top of the Big Thumb, if it wasn't too far away, and if it was really the same place his great-grandfather found refuge, and if, after 100 years or so, water was still there. It didn't seem likely, not when the entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought they'd still have to come back here eventually. They'd both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingers. Instead, he came up with a better idea, although he didn't have it quite all figured out yet. He thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube if she wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make the deal without getting himself into deeper trouble. She might just say, "Tell me where you found it, or I'll scratch you too." Plus, it would mean X-Ray would get in trouble too. She'd probably scratch him as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. He dug his shovel into the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting guard by the water spigot outside the shower wall. Mr. Pendanski had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. "I always knew he was stupid," Stanley heard him say. Stanley was required to dig only 1 hole the next day. As he dug, he kept a constant watch out for Zero, but never saw him. Once again, he considered going out on the lake to look for him, but he began to realize he was already too late. His only hope was that Zero found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-grandfather had found it. For some reason, his great-grandfather had felt the urge to climb to the top of that mountain. Maybe Zero would feel the same urge? If it was the same mountain, if the water was still there. He tried to convince himself it wasn't impossible. There had been a storm just a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It wasn't impossible. He returned to his tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir, and Mr. Pendanski waiting for him. "Have you seen Zero?" the warden asked him. "No." "No sign of him at all?" "No." "Do you have any idea where he went?" "No." "You know you're not doing him any favors if you're lying," said Mr. Sir. "He can't survive out there for more than a day or 2. "I don't know where he is." All 3 stared at Stanley, as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Pendanski's face was so swollen he could barely open his eyes. They were just little slits. "You sure he has no family?" the warden asked Mr. Pendanski. "He is a ward of the state," Mr. Pendanski told her. "He was living on the streets when he was arrested." "Is there anyone who might ask questions? Some social worker who took an interest in him?" "He had nobody," said Mr. Pendanski. "He was nobody." The warden thought a moment. "Okay, I want you to destroy all of his records." Mr. Pendanski nodded. "He was never here." Mr. Sir nodded. "Can you get into the state files from your computer?" she asked Mr. Pendanski. "I don't want anyone in the AG's office to know he was here." "I don't think I can erase him completely from the state files," said Mr. Pendanski. "Too many cross-references. But I can make it so it would be very difficult for anyone to ever find a record of him. Like I said, though, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni." "Good," said the warden. Chapter 32. 2 days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian, but X-Ray called him Twitch because he was always fidgeting. Twitch was assigned to Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hotwire the engine in all less than a minute. "I never planned to, steal one," he told them. "But sometimes, I'll just be walking past a real nice car, parked in a deserted area, and, I'll just start twitching. If you think I twitch now, you should see me around a car. Next thing I know, I'm behind the wheel." Stanley lay on his scratchy sheets. It occurred to him that his cot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away, or if he'd just gotten used to it. "Hey, caveman," said Twitch. "Do we really have to get up at 4:30? "You get used to it," Stanley told him. "It's the coolest part of the day." He tried not to think about Zero. It was too late. Either he'd made it to Big Thumb, or What worried him most, however, wasn't that it was too late. What worried him most, what really ate at his insides, was the fear that it wasn't too late. What if Zero was still alive, desperately crawling across the dirt searching for water? He tried to force the image out of his mind. The next morning, out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told Twitch the requirements for his hole. As wide as deep as your shovel. Twitch fidgeted. His fingers drummed against the wooden shaft of his shovel, and his neck moved from side to side. You won't be twitching so much after digging all day, Mr. Sir told him. You won't have strength to wiggle your pinky. He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, deftly chewed them, and spat out the shells. This isn't a Girl Scout camp. The water truck came shortly after sunrise. Stanley got in line behind Magnet, ahead of Twitch. What if he's too late? He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot, dry dirt remained in his head. He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot, dry dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive after more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He'd need a car. Or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water on the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir had left the keys in the ignition. He slowly backed away from the line, then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window. The keys were there, dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took a deep breath to steady himself and tried to think clearly. He'd never even driven before. But how hard could it be? This is really crazy, he told himself. Whatever he did, he knew he'd have to do it quickly, before Mr. Sir noticed. It's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived. But what if it isn't too late? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. But there wasn't time to think. He flung open the door to the truck and climbed quickly inside. Hey! Shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key and stepped on the gas pedal. The engine revved. The truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal on the floor. The engine roared, but the truck stood motionless. Mr. Sir came running around the side of the truck. The door was still open. Put it in gear! Shouted Twitch. The gear shift on the floor was on the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back until the arrow pointed to the letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward. Stanley jerked back against the seat and tightly gripped the wheel as the truck accelerated. His foot pressed to the floor. The truck went faster and faster across the dry lake bed. It bounced over a pile of dirt. Suddenly, Stanley slammed forward and instantly backwards as the airbag exploded in his face. He fell out of the open door and onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay on the dirt staring at the truck, which sunk lopsided into the ground. He sighed. He couldn't blame his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather this time. This time it was his own fault. 100%. He had probably just done the stupidest thing he'd ever done in his short, miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore, but he didn't think he'd broken any bones. He glanced back at Mr. Sir, who remained where he was, staring at Stanley. He ran. His canteen was strapped around his neck. It banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty. 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 And that is where we are going to end for today. All right, let's discuss our chapters today. Chapter 29 is the first chapter in part 2 of the book. So they split it into 2 parts. And this part is called The Last Hole. All right, what did Stanley believe he had seen for a split second during a flash of lightning? He looked up toward the mountains, and he thought he'd seen a rock that looked like a thumb was up, right? Do you remember what his great-grandfather said he stayed at when he was robbed by Kate Barlow? God's thumb. A rock that looks like a thumb would probably be called that, right? He took refuge in God's thumb. Why did Mr. Pendanski fire his pistol into the air? There's a lot of things that led up to this, right? So we remember that Zero is helping Stanley dig his hole just a little bit so that Stanley will teach him how to read. Probably not the best choice, since the other boys do not like that. Well, Zigzag especially was not liking it that day, so he was pushing Stanley, and then Mr. Pendanski told Stanley to hit him back, which is not what we should do. And then it got bad, right? Zigzag wouldn't stop hitting Stanley. Zero put a chokehold around Zigzag, and Armpit had to throw him apart, and then Mr. Pendanski shot his pistol in the air. How did the warden react when she discovered that Zero was digging part of Stanley's hole? Not well. No. She was not happy about that, right? Because Stanley is supposed to be building character by digging his own hole. I do agree with Stanley that, Zero should probably learn to read, though, especially if he wants to. How did Zero react when Mr. Pendanski handed Zero the shovel and told him it was all he was good for? Well, once again, not nice. Mr. Pendanski is so mean and rude to Zero. Zero is a smart guy. He knew all those math things very quickly, and he was learning to read so fast. Well, Zero hit him with a shovel. And then he ran. What did the warden mean by saying it was time to paint her nails again? Well, do you remember that she had this special nail polish that she scratched Mr. Sir's face with, right? It has rattlesnake venom in it. And it hurts. Where did Stanley think that Zero might have taken some refuge? Where did he go? Well, Stanley hoped that he found God's thumb, right? Because there should be water at it. Hopefully. Why does the warden repeatedly ask Mr. Pendanski if Zero, Hector Zeroni, had any family or social worker who might have taken an interest in him? She is trying to get out of looking for Zero, right? And also trying to save her butt, because she would get in a lot of trouble if a kid ran away and they ignored it for 4 days. Boy. Why was the new boy given the nickname of Twitch? He just kept fidgeting all the time. What did he do to get to Camp Green Lake? He stole a car. He said he just gets all twitchy. Oh boy. Why did Stanley steal Mr. Sir's truck? He had a little faith and hope that Zero is still alive and okay. And he thought the only way he could get to him is driving to him. And driving to him with a thing full of water is probably a good idea. But what happened when Stanley tried to steal the truck? Well, he had never driven before, so he didn't even know how to put it into gear, which isn't good. So he was just kind of stuck there in park. And then he ran into a hole. So, as Stanley ran away, he did not have a vehicle or water. Well, that is where we are going to end for today. I hope you have enjoyed our chapters of holes, and we will see you all next time. Bye, everyone!